What kind of industries have been the hardest hit?
So the items that were picked for this 50% tariff were very selected. And I think it seems like it's been played this way to try to create some divide within the nation. And I think they've been doing a good job so far of leaning back on it, saying we won't all feel it the same, but we're going to all feel it a little bit.
This is Trade Finance Talks, your go-to podcast on cross-border trade, brought to you by Trade Finance Global.
Hello and welcome to Trade Finance Talks. I'm Mahika Ravishankar, Deputy Editor at Trade Finance Global. On the 24th of August, a renewed trade war broke out between Canada and the US. Talks between US President Donald Trump and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney dissolved over the weekend, and it was just announced that the US will be slapping Canada with a 50% tariff on 5% of Canadian goods. The worst impact is on car and automotive parts, where tariffs doubled from current levels of 25%. Other impacted industries include Canadian exports of electronics, industrial machinery, and dairy products. To do this, Trump invoked Section 338 of a trade act dating back to 1930. This essentially was an anti-competition clause at a time of economic depression. Canada and the US have been strong partners historically, trading roughly $909 billion worth of goods, and united under the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or the USMCA. During Trump's second term, this relationship has deteriorated sharply. Build in the US and there are zero tariffs, Trump posted on his Truth Social platform. Canada will be treated like a state no longer. I wanted to learn more about what these tariffs meant practically for the Canadian small businesses who rely on the US market. So I reached out to Kyle Peacock of Peacock Tariff Consulting. Kyle took his experience after nearly 15 years as Nestlé's Senior Director of Supply Chain for North America to establish his own firm. His goal is to help educate SMEs around the world so they best understand their own value in global trade flows when they may not have vast compliance desks to support them. Kyle, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure. Happy to be here.
So to start, can you please tell me a little bit about your background? What's your experience and what brought you to setting up Peacock Tariff Consulting?
Of course. So my background is in trade compliance, born and raised in Central Ontario, and all my education was trade compliance. Unfortunately, there wasn't a lot of manufacturing and trade at that time, many years ago. So my career took me overseas, mostly to Western Europe, working with multinational CPG companies. Nestle in particular, I did lead Nestle's trade compliance division in Switzerland for close to 5 years. It was during this time that I noticed there was a lot of acquisitions of small to medium-sized enterprises that didn't understand or didn't recognize the value in their supply chain or trade compliance during these acquisitions. And so I decided I wanted to stop playing for the Yankees, and I went out about 5 years ago and started my own firm, Peacock Tariff Consulting. And our goal is to really help educate and provide that knowledge in a discipline that isn't very available very easily.
And what kind of industries the companies which you work with in?
We're industry agnostic, which is wonderful. So we'll do everything from chemicals to oil to manufacturing goods, all the way to clothing products. It's very interesting that no day is the same. And the fact that we're able to be customizable and approach it a little bit more in depth than some of the normal brokers out there, it gives us the opportunity to really show the value in each industry to our professionals.
Thank you. I guess it would be good to start the current situation. Can you just explain the Section 388 tariffs, everything that's been happening over the weekend, but from maybe the vantage point of what you're communicating to your clients and customers?
Of course. So Section 338, it's never been done before. And this is something from 1930 that the administration's rushing off and using.
Do you know what the purpose of it was when it was written?
It was to penalize anyone that was going out of their way to penalize the US. So it was used as a tactic to ensure that product was being produced and nothing was being either dumped, or that US didn't have exposure to the greater world economy in 1930. So the reason why this one is in effect now is that the US is determined that the Canadian country has not allowed US booze into their market. So because we've gone out of our way to not allow US booze, they're saying this now applies and we can penalize them accordingly.
It's interesting that it's like prohibition era and this is all centered around booze.
Exactly. And it's going to be very interesting because unfortunately, it's where you start the story or stop the story on if it holds up in court. Now, the US complaint is Canadians will not allow booze on the shelf, and they're purposely hurting the US economy based on this and the US booze producers. And now, if you start the story at the certain time period we're at, yes, it's true. It will stand up. Now, if you look at why Canadians took US booze off the shelf, it was because there was tariffs put on certain sectional areas that was, I'd say, not in the faith of the agreement with CUSMA or USMCA. So if you start the story at the very beginning of why this happened, it may have legs in the court to be overturned. Unfortunately, I think they'll only look at the here and now, and that the Canada was not allowing US booze on the market. And so legally, I think we won't see the Supreme Court come to our rescue on this aspect.
Maybe you'll be surprised because I guess they've repealed other tariffs in the past. So hopefully they'll be able to take a wider picture.
It's like any business. We had current clients that were proactive for this announcement coming down. And then we've had clients that were very much panicking over the weekend that were reaching out. And mostly they want to know how they're affected and they want to know which products in their portfolio are affected. Obviously, every company has a certain margin they apply to products. And our clients have reached out to us and said, okay, identify which products do not have enough margin to be able to continue selling to the US, and let's stop selling those products. So the real losers here are the US consumers that won't have the same scope of products that they'll be able to purchase from. Because as the supply chain runs out, there's going to be shortages on certain products.
And what kind of products are we talking about here?
So we're talking about everything from plastics to something as simple as maple syrup. These tariffs, I think they were almost used as a pilot project to see if they would be able to hold up because they were targeting Canadian identity products, maple syrup, hockey equipment, manufacturing, those kind of items. I think you'll see that now that's in effect, and if it's working and no one overturns it, you'll see that this is a tool used at a greater aspect within Canada and in the world and other countries that the US administration have issues with.
And for the Canadian SMEs, you mentioned that they're scrapping these products entirely that are too expensive to trade to the US. Are they looking to sell to other markets elsewhere?
They are. So we're seeing a significant amount of clients or potential clients or new clients reaching out to us saying, it's just too uncertain right now with the US. We don't want to sell to the US. We want to sell to the UK, Europe, Japan, other markets. How do we do this? And I'd say Canada became complacent with NAFTA over the last 40 years. It just makes sense that you're able to sell to this huge, large market just south of you. And there wasn't a whole lot of looking at additional new markets within the world. And that's what Canadian SMEs are doing on a very quick basis right now of, okay, how do we do it? Well, what's the distribution networks? How do we sell maple syrup to the UK without either cannibalizing who already there or if there's enough market for it?
What kind of industries have been the hardest hit?
So the items that were picked for this 50% tariff were very selected. So we're seeing it more the Ontario, the East Coast, and then the West Coast, but not so much Alberta or Quebec, which we know is, I'd say there's some separatist concerns of those provinces. And I think it seems like it's been played this way to try to create some divide within the nation. And I think they've been doing a good job so far of leaning back on it, saying, we won't all feel it the same, but we're going to all feel it a little bit.
That's really interesting. Have the tariffs caused insolvencies among Canadian SMEs?
Yeah, it has. So unfortunately, I think the uncertainty has caused it as much as the cost. So there's some, just with the age of the business owners within Canada, I think you're seeing that they are just looking at this and saying, is it worth our while to continue with this uncertainty? Or, we're at the retirement age, we had a good career, let's close up shop and move on. So we're seeing a lot closure of businesses, but it's based on the uncertainty and the additional costs. But I wouldn't say it's because they couldn't make a go of it. It's just the effort wasn't always the ideal aspect there. So if you're at a certain age, are you ready for another fight in that sense?
Yeah.
So I think there's been a lot of that where it's just been, we're going to close down electrical, plumbing places, like smaller enterprises, just because the products from the US are too expensive.
Automotive tariffs, which have just been announced. Any updates on that sector?
We're located in Ontario, so we understand that it's a large automotive hotbed, and a lot of our products and supply chain crosses the border multiple times. So we have a lot of, I'd say, our production that would take place in raw materials that were being manufactured in, say, Detroit, going to Windsor for the process, back to Detroit, back to Windsor. It was all integrated in the supply chain there. Whereas now the tariffs, if they're up to 50 or 100%, depending on the product, the actual cost to the user will be about $6,000 on, say, a Ford truck, just from the additional tariffs crossing the border both ways. And unfortunately, that will get passed on to the consumer.
You said cost to the user rather than to the supplier.
Yeah. So the supplier will, as you're importing the product, it will be the importer, but then they'll pass it on to all the way down the supply chain. So the first one where you're taking that just straight aluminum or steel, that gets added, the tariff cost gets added, then to the next it will get added. So you're going to see the 50% just be that combination effort.
What will the effect be for the Detroit processing plant who is reliant on this trade northwards with?
Now they're going to have to try to find these materials. And we've seen within our current clients as well that as they put tariffs on these items in the US, so now that the US isn't getting as much steel from the international market, they don't have the actual manufacturing punching units or processing fabrication. So a lot of US companies acquired Canadian fabrication companies thinking that it was the appropriate means. And now, unfortunately, the tariffs are making that redundant. So our clients that are cross-border are looking at it saying, okay, well, it doesn't make sense to ship the product to produce in Canada anymore, but we don't have the supply in the US. So what do we do? So all it's doing is adding longer lead times to production to be produced. And I'd say the steel manufacturers are really looking at how do they increase their output? And right now they don't have the time to be able to increase their output for the demand on steel. So it really seems to be causing a lot of shocks in the supply chain. And I'd be interested to see what happens next if they take the same approach with the southern border of Mexico, or if we see some international allowances on metal fabrication.
Thank you. To summarize everything, what would be your advice to Canadian SMEs right now in terms of how best to stay resilient?
So my best advice is to be overindulged in compliance right now. So what we're seeing is since the CBP and Department of Homeland Security have started using AI, they are indicating and finding on every entry that has incorrect information. And in the past, it wasn't an issue between Canada and the US because there wasn't any tariffs. There wasn't the same process or auditing process. But now, for instance, if you're producing something in Ontario and when you fill out your documentation, you say it's an across the border in Buffalo, say there's an accident, delays in Buffalo, the carrier changes it and goes through Detroit, but you don't update your paperwork in the inbound, they'll fine you $10,000 for your first strike. So that's like the biggest is paperwork accuracy is the biggest thing. And that goes back to being complacent. They've never had to worry about it. And now all of a sudden it's like getting a new teacher that is super strict compared to an old teacher that would let you, get away with spelling errors or grammar. And all of a sudden you're seeing not just red marks on the page, but you're getting penalized as well. And that seems to be the biggest thing that we're seeing is how do we get out of this penalization and who pays the cost? We filled it out right. The carrier changed the plan, but the pain's being pushed down the supply chain. Does it fall on the brokers, the carriers? We're seeing that kind of turn a lot of relationships that were very strong into some ugly relationships.
How does that feed into SME relationships with financial institutions? What can banks and other institutions, maybe the government, export credit agencies, how can they all support SMEs at this time?
I think they're doing a good job, but there is gaps. So the government is doing a great job. Same with the prime minister making these deals with Europe, the UK, other markets. But the problem is they aren't helping them in turn. So it's, you have a product, you're in Southern Ontario, you ship to the US because it's close. It's, 300 kilometers, whereas now all of a sudden you have to ship it to a port, ship it across the ocean. How does your logistics cost? How do you get it there? How do you integrate it into a market that you've never known? And there may be a language barrier. And that seems to be where the Canadian government's had a little bit of downfalls. They've got the country available, but they don't have the guidance for the infrastructure. So that's what we're seeing from our team and a lot of clients saying, okay, well, how do we get there? Like, that's great. You've opened this market up for us, but you haven't helped us understand the process or shipping fees before you call a carrier, they drive it. Now all of a sudden you need to call an ocean carrier, a driver overseas, the distribution market, the sales. There's just a whole other leg that isn't being, I'd say, at the same level as the deals are. And I know it takes time. Unfortunately, time isn't something that we have.
And do you know about what the asks would be for banks?
The banks is very interesting because as the tariffs happened, the bonds are increasing with the US. So companies are having to put more out on their bonds, as well as we're seeing that it's really at the point where a lot of companies are almost fully liquidated on the sense that they don't have a lot of equity left to request. There has been, I'd say, measures put in place from the government, but I don't think the banks have been very helpful in that sense yet. I think you'll see that it comes in the future, but unfortunately, we haven't seen the banks have the same reprieve that the government has with some of their loan lending units.
Great. Kyle, thanks so much for coming on the podcast with such short notice as well, just immediately after this announcement. I really appreciate having you on.
Oh, it was my pleasure. Happy to be here.